my game in the Cochrane gambit of the Petrov defense from last year. And I just recently showed a couple cool games in the Petrov defense that looked interesting for white. And a couple people asked me, hey, David, why don't you show your own game? Your own game was great. Well, I don't think my own game is anything that special. Like, it's aesthetically pleasing to me, but I don't think it's, such an amazing achievement by me. But since people have asked for it, I mean, I can't really say no. It's pretty easy for me to show and explain this game. And along the way, I'm going to show and explain a couple other games in the Petrov defense Cochrane variation, which allowed me to learn this opening. So basically, this was a one-shot game by me. This is the only time I ever played the Cochrane. I had prepared it for that game, and I studied the Cochrane Gambit for about 3 hours one day in my entire life. That's it. But in those 3 hours, I think I came to understand the opening pretty decently. So I'm going to walk you through the games that I looked at and how I learned the Cochrane Gambit. Not every single game I looked at, because we won't quite have the time, but I'm going to show you a couple cool ones that stood out for me. So here we go. Let's get started. In this position, black's counting on the retreat of the white knight to regain the e pawn by playing knight takes e4. White has an opportunity to, instead of giving black this e4 pawn, to instead give black the knight for the f pawn. And that's basically like trading your knight for your own e4 pawn, your opponent's f7 pawn, and your opponent's right to castle. Normally, that would be a slightly bad trade for white. According to my own math, which I've been told by grandmasters not to use, but according to my own math of adding up little things, you're trading 2 pawns and the right to castle for a knight when your opponent can actually castle by hand pretty easily. So it's like maybe something close to a fair trade, but since you trade off your developed knight and then you're down a tempo in development, I think overall, basically, this is a way for white to give up their opening advantage, which they could have had by playing knight to f3. And after knight takes f7, I think that white has, given black probably equality. But nevertheless, I mean, in chess, you don't necessarily always need to have an advantage out of the opening with white, right? I mean, sometimes you just want to play an interesting game, and this will probably lead to equality, but an interesting kind of equality where there's lots of interesting things you can play for both sides. So black evidently has to take this knight. And here there are 2 moves for white, and in my opinion, there is not a huge difference between them because they will actually transpose to the main line. And I should warn you, the one thing you're not going to learn in this lecture is what I consider to be the very, very main line of this opening in any real depth. I'll tell you right from the beginning what the best, first 2 moves are, but I'm not going to analyze it out all the way because I want to leave you something interesting to explore. Instead, I'll tell you the ideas, and then you can learn this opening for yourself if you're interested in it by playing some games yourself. So let's start off by looking at one of the games which first struck me as being really cool and interesting in this opening. This game here is played by a Georgian grandmaster by the name of Mechedishvili. As black, and a player named Shanava, who I don't know, but based on their rating is probably also a grandmaster, as white. And he's playing against a very strong player who I know of, so it's very bold and fearless of him to play the Cochrane Gambit against a good player like this. So he plays knight takes f7, and king takes f7, and here he plays d4, which along with knight c3, as I said, are the two main moves. And black played bishop to e7. We'll talk about other moves in this position a little bit later, but for now, bishop to e7, we can explain why this move makes sense. The idea is that black wants to play either rook to f8 or rook to e8, and then play king to g8. And they're completing development quite quickly, actually. Even though white's the one who sacrificed material, black's completing development very quickly, and they are securing their king position, so it's very logical. White continues with knight to c3. And now black plays the move c6, and I think this move is designed to answer bishop c4 check with d5. So if you continued with your plan of castling by hand here, and white played bishop to c4 check, now black would have to choose between d5, sacrificing a pawn, and bishop to e6. Now d5 would often be a really good idea, and if white had to take with his pawn and you could play bishop d6 for black, you would have sacrificed a pawn, but you've got these two doubled pawns firmly blockaded, and that would be quite acceptable for black. But in this position, maybe white can take with his knight, and now you still can't run away with your king because white will play any kind of move with their knight, wreaking havoc on black's position. And so you would have to make some more trades, and you had to bring your king out anyway. Only you're risking lots of bad things that can happen to you here. So, I mean, to be more accurate, black would probably have to play something like bishop to e6 in this position here. And I don't think that pawn sack is so great, so I think simpler for black is just to play bishop e6 right away. And white will trade, and black will take back. And this might be playable for black, but to justify the rook f8 move, they partly need to have the time to return this king like this. I think this line might be playable for black, but I understand why someone would want to avoid that by playing c6 here before they play rook to f8. And after c6, white just continues his development for the next two moves very calmly. Bishop d3, defending his e4 pawn and not walking into bishop c4, d5. Rook to e8, white castles, and I believe black plays king to g8 now. And this is the first position where we're going to learn something about how to play the Cochrane gambit for white. What move would you play here for white? Well, to me, the obvious move for white, before I had studied this opening at all, would have been f4. Partly just because I have a tendency to play overly aggressive moves. But also because, like, I would think the point of this opening is, hey, we want to set up all these pawns in the center and really sort of stifle black with them. And that's partly right. That is white's idea in this opening. But it's also partly, but it's not understanding the correct methods, right? So there's always strategy and tactics in chess. And tactics are often the means by which you achieve your strategic goal. So your strategic goal here, yes, it is to play f4. But why do you want to play f4? Well, your more overarching strategical goal is to try and keep the black pieces from having good squares using your two central pawns that you have extra. Try and keep all the black pieces limited. And let me try and explain this idea as well as I can. I'm not sure if everyone will understand this immediately, but when somebody tells you the value of a piece in terms of points, you know, the system where a pawn is worth 1, a knight is worth 3, a bishop is worth 3, a rook is worth 5, and a queen is worth 9. In this system here, everybody knows that this is not like exact math, right? But even before we discuss a question like, well, is a bishop worth, 3.1 and a knight is worth 3, trying to get more nuanced. Before we even do that, we should understand that this number doesn't represent an immutable number. It represents an average, right? So you understand that sometimes a knight is really well placed, sometimes it's badly placed. a really well-placed knight versus a really badly placed knight, there's a great difference in strength, right? I mean, just looking at this position, for example, black's knight on f6 is a lot better than the knight on b8 at the moment, or black's rook on e8 is worth more than the rook on a8 right now. And this is the basis for, exchange sacrifices where a knight or a bishop ends up on a really good square and is better than a rook, and all sorts of other operations in chess. We understand that pieces are worth different amounts. So for example, if a knight is worth on average 3, let's say I limit black's knights and make them kind of bad pieces. Conceivably, each of black's knights might be worth, 2.5 instead of 3. And in that case, basically part of my calculation of the material balance in the position would be like, oh, each of black's pieces is worth a tiny bit less than normal, so actually I'm not down so much material. So you understand white could have this position with a couple pawns and 3 minor pieces versus 4 minor pieces, and you could say, oh, with this nice center, all the white pieces have happy squares. Just imagine this bishop on e3. All these white pieces have happy squares. The black pieces can't get very active. They don't have a lot of options. I think each of the black pieces is worth, 2.7 or 2.8. So, I think material's about equal, actually. Now, you should be careful not to double count things. Like, you might be counting the value of white center pawns and then counting the value of the black pieces as being less because they're limited by the center pawns, but the value of the center pawns is that they limit the black pieces' value. Sorry, I know that's going to be confusing to somebody, but the idea is be careful about double counting. Don't count like the value of your pawns for being good and then the value of their pieces for being limited if the value of the pawns is just that they're limiting the opponent's pieces. So white's goal is to limit the black pieces. And one way to do that is to play f4 at some point and gain more space and take away more squares. But you need to be really careful as you advance your pawns that you don't give the black pieces squares as you go forward or ways to attack your pawns. So for example, f4 probably has 2 things that I don't like about it. One is bishop to g4. That gets the black bishop out from c8 and then allows knight to d7 to develop behind it. Now, this is not the worst problem, I think, with f4. After queen to e1, knight to d7, you can play h3, bishop h5, g4, bishop f7, and the black bishop is a bit better here than it was on c8, but you have made some progress with these pawn moves, and so it's not completely hopeless for white to have allowed bishop to g4. The bigger problem for white is probably queen to b6, attacking the center pawn on d4, which is not very strong. And after bishop to e3, to avoid queen to d4 check, black could play knight to g4, attacking the bishop on e3. And I think this is unsatisfactory for white completely. So, white does not start with f4 in this position. They start with a little careful move, pawn to h3, stopping bishop g4 and knight g4. Now, the funny thing about this is that in general, I tell my students to not play too many moves like pawn to h3, pawn to a3, just trying to take one square away from your opponent's piece. Normally, you want to develop your pieces more forcefully, allow moves like bishop g4 or knight g4, but have some counter that you can do, right? Like if your opponent hunts down the bishop pair with knight to g4, in this example with bishop e3 that we had a moment ago, a lot of times in chess I would tell my students, look for some way to just keep developing, and, the piece that replaces the bishop on e3 should be well placed and your center should still be strong. However, in this particular example, since white's goal is really to limit black's pieces and use the space advantage and the pawns to limit black's pieces, just the fact of this one piece trade is really a big accomplishment for black. And that's why you see moves like h3 in this particular opening. Another opening where I would play moves like h3 for white is the Benoni. And that's another opening where black really, really, really wants to trade one minor piece by using the g4 square with bishop to g4, or in some case maybe knight g4, knight e5. And so it's a position where the piece trade is worth so much that you spend a tempo on a move like h3 to avoid it. So here white plays h3. Very nice, calm move by 𝐈𝐴𝐻𝐵. And the game continues. Black develops the knight to a6 because they don't want to block in this bishop. And they'll come to c7 probably with the knight in most cases and be able to participate in the center a little bit. But also, black is considering playing knight to b4. So for example, on f4, he might play knight to b4, trying to trade a piece. Bishop to e2 is what I would try for white in response. And then maybe bishop to f8, attacking this pawn on e4. Just a possibility for black. And white was in absolutely no hurry here and calmly limited another black piece, a3. So black's going to have to spend another move on the knight to go to c7. White just calmly keeps these black pieces limited. Now black plays a move whose value I'm not sure of, which is pawn to g6. And I don't quite know the reason for this move. So if you want to know the reason for this move, you're going to have to try and send an email to Mr. Mechedishvili. White continues with their plan with f4. Black plays bishop back to f8. So he's opening up the rook's power on the e-file. I think like another possible plan maybe would have been to play bishop e6 to f7. I definitely would also play bishop to f8. So bishop to f8 makes sense. I guess g6 gives it the possibility of bishop g7, but I don't know that you need to commit to g6 so soon. So I might have played like bishop e6, bishop f7, bishop f8, something like that as black, and knight c7. But basically, this position here is actually pretty good for white. So that's one thing to note, is that, you know, even though I'm suggesting some series of moves for black there, I already think that white has a pretty nice position in this particular variation, because as you see, like, black doesn't have any really good way of countering white's center, and so his pieces are remaining constricted, right? Like, if you take this bishop and you put it on f7, does that do anything special for you? Do you see any plan for black from that position? I don't really, right? So I feel like black is still kind of struggling a little bit in this position. I think white's center is solid. The key thing to always calculate is, you know, what happens if black plays a c5 or a d5 break? So for example, if black plays d5, it's not too hard to figure out. White's plan is to play e5. And now the black pieces didn't gain any new squares particularly. They could try for this f5 square. That's the only square they've maybe gained. But it's not so bad for white to play g4 and just take that square away and gain more space on the king side. So they're not yet in position to play d5 on any of these moves. You can always calculate it. d5, e5 looks pretty good for white in all cases. If I were black, what I would do with d5, by the way, is I would play knight e4 and sacrifice a third central pawn in order to try and gain this square here for the black pieces. But in my opinion, you know, white's just a little bit better in this position with 3 pawns against the piece. But it's playable, right? Because the knight can come to c7 and black can play to d5. So, I mean, if you're really afraid that you might be already, you know, in big trouble here or losing as black, you can definitely play a continuation like that, sack a pawn, and stay in the game. Well, anyway, let's pursue with our game a little bit, because I just want to go over some more ideas. Black plays bishop to f8, and here white plays f5 to start a kingside attack. Now, I personally would play probably a simpler move here, just g4. That's the move which I like for white. You might be wondering why I don't play bishop to e3 developing this piece, and that's because the piece would be hanging on the e-file with the rook, so I'm worried about some possible tactics here, such as, for example, bishop to f5, and it's complicated what's going on. It might still be good for white, but I would definitely worry about some variations like that. Playing white. To me, g4 seemed like the simplest. Again, I want to play f5, but I want it to be defended, and I don't want to have to calculate, what happens after black takes on f5, which, 𝐲𝐿𝐴𝐵 was braver than me, and he did some calculations. But basically, what I would do is I'd play g4, black repositions the bishop. Now I'll play bishop e3. There's no bishop f5 move. And black could play queen to b6 or something like that. And I would just calmly advance f5 here, and I think white has a pretty good game. Note that black can't take this pawn on b2. This looks very happy for white to me. I think white still has a bit of an advantage. But in the game, he initiates sharper fighting with f5. So it's a challenging move. He's going for a bishop development on g5 instead of e3. And black takes the pawn. Bishop comes out, and now white's definitely going to have to play for some pressure on the f-file and some tactics, because they've given up their rock solid center, and they'll never be able to completely dominate the black pieces again through the center of the board. Just gets off the diagonal of queen b6, which is a potential defense for black, trying to get off the diagonal of white's bishop. Black can't yet take on e4, or should I say doesn't yet really want to take on e4, because after knight e4 it increases the pressure on f6 a lot, and black's going to have to sacrifice some material. Either their queen with knight to g3 check, or just an exchange, but in any case, not a thrilling option for black. So they bring the knight towards the king side, which is well-intentioned, but when I went over the game, I found that queen b6 offered perhaps slightly more complicated chances for black. So played knight to c7. White develops the queen onto the f-file, increasing the pressure against f6. And white just continues developing. Now their position is perfect. Rook a to e1 is a really nice move to make. When you play moves like this, it feels like you're about to win, even if you're down a piece and the position is complicated. Because the whole position for white, if they disregard that black has an extra piece, just looking at white's position, it looks like everything is set up perfectly. And now black gets tired of defending and tries to counter in the center with d5. Now that the knight is unpinned, e5 wouldn't win the knight, right? It could just move into e4, defended by the f-pawn and d-pawn. If black didn't do that, how would white proceed? Well, I think one thing white might even do at some point is push g4 to increase the pressure on f5 and f6. But black may even have been worried about pawn takes pawn eventually. I don't think pawn takes pawn myself, because well, it's hard to make a move for black. But let's say I make some move for black and we play pawn takes pawn, then the black knight would get this square here. So personally, I feel like this is probably how white would continue the game. Possibly preparing it by moving the queen to f4 instead of f3, so that f takes g4 wouldn't attack the queen. So anyway, the game goes d5. White plays e5 anyway. Black puts the knight into e4. And what on earth is white's plan? White, who's down a piece, and now black has the e6 square for that knight next, and the e4 square for this knight. Well, white had an incredible idea, and this shows just how much he had to be willing to calculate to play f5 on move 12 and make the position so sharp. White just takes on e4, allowing black to win more material for his pawns. So knight takes e4, pawn takes e4, and white sacrifices what? the bishop, the queen, the rook, the rook. Rook takes e4. This is really an impressive conception by white. If black takes it, they will lose. They didn't take it. But f e4, queen e4 would be the follow-up. Okay, it's clear that this move threatens checkmate, so black needs to defend h7 along the second rank, brings the bishop back to do so, and now I would add white's rook to the attack. Well, I mean, it's already on a pretty good file, right? But maybe we can do even better. Rook to f3 with the idea of bishop f6, rook g3, kind of attacking notions. The only defender I can think of bringing over for black is rook e7, and I'll just show you one sample variation of how the game could go. Bishop f6, knight to d5, queen switches over to h4 because I want to check on g3, and then when you block, I want to take on h7. So queen over to h4, h6, rook g3, check, rook g7, takes, queen takes. And white is still down material, but they are winning. And this is where I stopped one of my variations, because white is going to be able to follow up with queen to h7 and then either rook f3 or taking on g7 depending on how black defends. Basically, there's no defense left for black in this position here. I mean, even that final position, it's a little bit surprising, but if you look for a little bit, you'll see that black cannot defend it anymore. So hang on, backing up. Black did not accept the rook sacrifice. Instead, they brought the queen over, stopping queen to h5 and defending the f7 pawn with the bishop. So basically, white has just won a pawn from this knight trade on e4, but they've also not regained the pawn on f5 yet. So they play rook h4, still 2 pawns in the center against a piece. Black now has the d5 and e6 squares available, and of course, they hurry to take them, right, by developing the bishop. And it looks like black might get chances in this position, but white plays a strong move now, c4. That stops bishop to d5, which would then be followed by knight e6. And if bishop takes c4, white can play bishop takes on f5. So white played c4. Black defends the f7 pawn with rook to f8. Makes sense. And now white plays g4. And again, like, I would probably play another move which would allow me to not calculate. When I looked over the game, I thought b3 would be an even stronger move, defending c4 and thus d5, and leaving the black pieces stuck for the moment. And then I think I can just play g4 next move, right? And then win the pawn on f5 because of the h7 threat. And then white should be able to comfortably roll black up with his pawns without thinking too hard. But white played g4 now. Black takes their chance to use their piece, taking out the center pawn, gaining the d5 square for good. White trades and takes back on f5. So now basically white's just going to play f6 at some point, and it's clear that white's passed pawns are worth at least a piece, so white probably has a bit of an advantage. And black went down pretty hard with rook to f7 here. And I'll show you one more variation to illustrate how these kinds of games could go. I would have defended with queen to d5, trying to trade queens, succeeding in trading queens. And now white pushes f6. Now, you see that the rook on f1's undefended, so it looks like white's not threatening f takes g7. Does white have no threat here, or do they have a threat? Congratulations to anyone who thought of rook to g1. That would be a really good threat, because then black couldn't save the bishop on g7 anymore, at least not without losing a lot of other material. So rook to g1 is the threat, and now I considered h6 for black. See, a move like king to f7 doesn't help because he takes, and a move like king to h8 doesn't help because he takes. So the rook g1 threat is not at all easy to deal with. So h6, so That's what I'd play for black. And now I considered either rook to g1 or rook to g4. Now rook to g1, they can take, whoops, sorry, mouse slip, take, and then sack the knight on f6, and black keeps the extra bishop on g7. So that's not good. But interestingly, I found that rook g4 is stronger than bishop takes h6. Here's what bishop takes h6 would look like. Now, white has 4 pawns against the knight, which is usually really good, but black has these pawns pretty well blockaded at the moment, and they play rook h8, and I think they'll get a little bit of counterplay, because their rooks can get active on these 2 files. So because of that, what I would prefer is to trade rooks with the move rook to g4, pawn takes, rook to f7, rook g1. Now, this way I won't get the b pawn because it's black's move. They can save it, and I'll get this position. But I'd rather play this position with 3 pawns than the position where black's 2 rooks become active. And I think here white has an advantage with 3 pawns against the knight. But I'm not 100% sure that endgame can be won because I haven't checked it deeply. So that's how I would try and defend for black here with queen to d5. That would be my last hope for black in this particular game. Black plays rook to f7. Rook to g1, of course, is a good move for the rook. Not too hard for us to find now. And on queen d5, you can just trade, and now you know that the move f6 will be strong enough. For white, they play f6, and black can't defend anymore if knight takes, bishop takes, and it's pinned. And if bishop to f8, then I think actually the easiest win is not a discovered check, but e6, catching this rook. For example, rook here, check, here, check. Whoops. Oh my goodness, I just hung something badly. Sorry, my apologies. All right, let's say on rook to c7 that I didn't hang that bishop like an idiot and instead just go take black's rook with bishop f4 check. So after f6, black gave back the piece, and white was winning pretty comfortably here with a nice, strong extra past the e5 pawn, and we won't go over the rest of that game. I will continue with a couple more really cool Cochrane Gambit games that I saw that helped me learn the ideas of this opening. For now, let me go back through this real quick and give you a couple quick pieces of feedback of what you should try to recall from this game. So first of all, these 2 moves, h3 and a3, limiting the black knights and bishops, limiting the black pieces, and then playing slowly with f4 and g4 and so on, right? And then going further ahead, the second thing to remember is that you have a choice between playing moves like f5 to go for attack and playing a real slow build-up with g4. And in general, in these positions, I would prefer the slower moves for white. But we saw this kind of aggressive play. I think we saw king to h1, knight c7, queen f3, queen d7, rook a e1, here, here, here. And the last thing that I want you to remember from this game is this beautiful rook takes e4 sacrifice, which is just really lovely. So there you have it. Really, really wonderful game by Mr. Shanava. And I've got a couple more wonderful games for you next. So stay tuned. This is International Master David Pruess. Till next time. Trying to teach you the ideas behind the Cochrane Gambit in the Petrov defense through a couple quick games, just as I learned it myself in 3 hours by playing through a couple of these games and studying them a little bit. And here we go. Today we're going to look at quickly a game from Šarūnas Solskas, who's a strong player. Gosh, I'm gonna get killed for this, but I'm not 100% sure if he's from Lithuania or Latvia, and I know that they wouldn't be happy to have me get that confused. I'm gonna say he's Lithuanian, and in either case, he's a really strong player who also speaks English and French fluently. I can attest from having been lucky enough to meet him once. And he is probably the strongest player to have played the Cochrane Gambit repeatedly. I know that Topalov played it once against Kramnik. That game is somewhat renowned. But anyway, today we've got 𝐓𝐡𝐞 playing a game, and after king takes f7, he played d4 here, and there's basically one extra possibility that playing d4 over knight c3 gives black, and that's this defense queen to e8, which is what his opponent played, right away threatening and attacking white's center. And here, white has to defend that e4 pawn, and he played knight to c3. I've never seen anyone play the move f3, but I might consider that move even if I were white, actually, because look, this pawn is well placed to limit this knight, which is in accordance with the principles for this opening. And black's queen to e8 move might not be so valuable as long as you defend e4, because it's actually boxing in the rook on h8 some more. So you haven't really lost a tempo, even if you later, after playing knight c3 and bishop d3 or something, choose to later push f4. You might not have lost a tempo because queen to e8 might not be a valuable move for black. So f3 might be possible, but in any case, the main move here is knight to c3. That's what's been played in the games that I've seen in this line. And now his opponent played the move knight to a6. And before we look at this game, I'll quickly show you another fragment. d5 is the most critical move here after knight to c3, for sure. Consistent with the queen and the knight move, black quickly attacks this e4 pawn. And this is the line which, if it's good for black, would suggest that white should play knight c3 before d4, or perhaps f3 instead of knight to c3. And I think this line is actually like fine for black. If you look at it, I've seen a game between two pretty strong masters, which I think goes like e5, which is probably correct, and bishop to b4, which is probably correct for black because they want to play knight to e4. And now white plays bishop to d3. And in this position, I don't know if anyone's ever played what I consider to be the best move, which would be knight to e4, sacrificing a pawn after queen f3 check. And after this, as black, I would trade that off and play queen to c6. And I think black's light squared bishop could get really good, and even though white has 3 pawns against the knight, he has a doubled pawn. He's got high chances of getting his pawns blockaded on the light squares, and then black might even have an edge in this endgame. So, I mean, that's a variation which hasn't been tested, which I haven't analyzed deeply, but I think that that's what's sort of critical. I know the move c5 is surprisingly bad after castles, takes. Now, this is like a typical kind of tactic, I guess I could say, for this opening, which is not particularly tactically based, but the couple tactics that there are in this opening almost always involve queen f3 check or queen h5 check at the very beginning of the game. And queen h5 check, g6, queen takes d5 check turns out to be quite good for white. For example, queen to e6, queen to b5. This actually follows a game that 𝐓𝐡𝐞 once played also, and white threatens bishop to c4 or queen takes b4. And it turns out this position is very good for white. 𝐓𝐡𝐞 won quickly against another grandmaster with this line once. So c5 is definitely not good, even though it's well-intentioned, right? I mean, black's trying to fight back sharply against white's position. But unfortunately, that for black, that queen h5, queen d5 seems to be strong for white. The game we're looking at, black played knight to c6. This is a very sane approach by black. White just castled in response, and black played knight takes e5, trading back the piece for 2 pawns, right? And you see now he's got a solid pawn in the center, and all he needs to do is play rook to f8 or rook to e8, and he'd have equality. Rook to e1, was played. And in this position, I think black has to be careful about where they choose to place their queen. I don't think that like playing something like queen d6 is good enough. I think queen h5 is a very strong move, which is what black played. And basically, white just developed. Black traded off the queens and then defended his d5 pawn with c6. And I think this is an example of pretty good play for black that leads to equality. And black eventually drew that game. So I think that's like a pretty good example of some possible defensive idea for black. Notice they struck back with d5, bishop to b4, very aggressive moves fighting for central squares. And then they're even willing to just return their piece to simplify the game and get equality. So that was a perfectly good example of play for black. But in this game here, black played knight to a6. And now, if you remember what I said in the first lecture about how the average value of a piece is what's intended when you say that a knight is worth 3, that means sometimes it's worth more, sometimes it's worth less. The same holds true for pawns. In general, in most phases of the game, in most phases of the game. How many phases are there, David? 7, 8? Okay, in the opening and middle game phases of the chess game, rook pawns are not worth as much as other pawns. So if you're saying that a pawn on average is worth 1, what you really mean is that D and E pawns are worth, a little bit more than 1, and that rook pawns are worth about 0.5 or 0.6. I mean, they're really not that great at the beginning of the game. So this gives white a chance to win some material, basically, by playing bishop takes a6, unless you think bishops are better than knights. Again, white doesn't really want to trade pieces in this opening, so when you trade pieces, it has to be for a really tangible reason. Well, here, by making this trade, you can divert one of black's pawns to the edge of the board and leave him with less pawns in the center to fight for central squares. And this is perfectly reasonable option for white here. But look at this really cool finesse which 𝐓𝐡𝐞 plays. This will teach you something about where to place bishops. He plays bishop c4 check, giving black a development tempo, and then trades on a6. So he could have had the same position with the black bishop on c8, but he brought it to e6 on purpose. On purpose. He developed his opponent's piece. Why? Well, against a position where white has a bunch of pawns in the center, it's really not optimal to place your bishops in the center where they can get harassed by those pawns. And also notice that the bishop's diagonals from being inside the center don't really help it control the center or fight against white's pawns, right? So actually this bishop would be much better placed on b7. And so he actually developed his opponent's piece on purpose to a square which looks perfectly reasonable because it would be even better on b7. So that's a really, really deep idea that white used there. So after trading off, they go back to simple Cochrane moves, castles, g6, f4. Right? g6 is probably really reasonable for black in this particular case because the bishop will be a bit better developing to g7 in one move, and white was going to play f4 anyway soon, possibly threatening f5, and you would want to not let white push f5 without trading the pawn, and then g4 and so forth. They just start rolling over black. So white's playing f4, which is a reasonable move. Black brings out the queen to c6, challenging this pawn, and white can't play the natural queen to f3 because of bishop c4, which is a kind of natural move in its own way, winning material. And the other option is queen f3, but I don't think that thrills white in any way, and it might be that black would answer with d5, with the idea of e5, knight e4, with the queen really controlling the light square as well. And black has pretty good chances to find squares for their pieces in that line. So white plays d5, also apparently winning a piece, but not. And queen to b6 check has to be played. King to h1, bishop to g4. So by now with white's pawn on d5, it's not as thrilling to go to b7, but it could still be considered because black might want to try and play c6 as soon as possible. You could also play bishop d7 to play c6 on the next move, or you could play bishop c8 and play for c6, but I think black's worried that bishop c8 to b7 is also going to be slow because of the rook on a8 getting stuck in that case. So anyway, bishop to g4 makes sense, and white brings up the queen to defend e4 and go on this nice central square. Since white has no light squared bishop, they want their queen and pawns to defend light squares. Queen to d3, rook to e8, bishop to e3, just developing, right? If black takes this pawn, white will be pretty happy to bring their rook into the game, and they can always collect some of these A pawns at least, even if they don't get the C pawn, which is what they really want. So bishop to e3, black played the move c5, and of course pawn takes pawn en passant, queen takes pawn doesn't help white at all. So black plays c5, and now in this position here, basically, like, you would like to play a move like e5 for white. I think that's another reason black put the pawn on c5 is, okay, let's say I didn't want to play that rook b7 idea. I mean, it's good, but, you know, a second idea, and you could do it after rook b7 or before rook b7, is to play e5. Sorry, unplugging my phone there to give us a little peace and quiet. And the point is that after bishop to d4, white's going to win some material, at least some material. At least everything is what one grandmaster once taught me when I was young. White wins at least everything. And that's another reason for black to put a pawn on c5 here. So bishop to e3, c5, and now white plays a really instructive move to try and crack at black's position. b4. Now, the analysis to show whether this is, you know, objectively good or bad is complicated, and we're not going to go through all of it now, but just look at this as a very useful technique to know to try and open the position. If black doesn't take the pawn, you can take on c5 next. And then if they take back, you'll be able to roll freely with e5. They can't take with their pawn because of their queen, right? So their only way to stop white's plan of breaking their pawn structure is to accept the pawn sacrifice with their queen, and then white gets this open file to penetrate with the rook while these pieces on f8 and h8 are not yet involved in the game. So this is how it goes. Rook a b1, queen to a5 gets played. Rook b7 check, rook e7 is not yet special, so white goes f5, trying to open the f file and possibly win back a piece by trapping the bishop on g4. G takes f5, h3. This is another common pattern in chess. You play f5 to keep the bishop from retreating. Then after they take back, you play h3 before capturing on f5. That's always an option, so don't assume that you have to just take back right away. So h3, and here, you know, the point of this h3 option is that on pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, you're threatening f6 and g4. So black did not oblige with f takes e4 in the game. Played bishop to h5. And now white doesn't play the best move, actually. He plays rook b7 check. He could have justified all his previous play with another move. If you're feeling like you're really strong or you just want a challenge, you can try and pause the video and come up with the best move for white in this position here. It took me a while to find it. I didn't find it the first time I studied these games. I found it when I was going over these games to get ready for this lecture. So not at all easy to find, but anyway, the best move here for white would have been bishop to g5. And after this move, I think that white has a really good game. They're kind of threatening rook takes f5. They're kind of threatening pawn to g4, trapping the bishop on h5. And I didn't really find any reasonable defense for black here. I mean, one line I tried went like this. Now rook comes down check, bishop to e7, and I think I just took on f5 now. Maybe I trade first, bring the king up, now take on f5, threatening knight to e4, and yeah, I didn't find any defense against knight e4 here because, see, this queen actually can't go to either of these squares to defend e4. The bishop can't get there either. And knight e4 is gonna win a lot, right? Because white's gonna either take on d6 or push f6. So this wins for white. That would have been the best continuation. But in the game, he gives rook check. Black finds the extremely obvious rook to e7, and now he plays another sacrificial move. So he sacked the f5 pawn. He didn't really want to take back because he wanted the file open for his rook. So now he sacks the e pawn, and at the same time sacks a little something else too, right? His rook on b7. Did you forget about that? It almost looks like he forgot about it. This really incredible move. It's kind of too bad that this isn't the best play objectively, but the game stuck with me because I loved this idea, the way Sulskis played this game. f5 pawn sack, then rook b7 check, then e5 leaving that rook behind. Lots of really strong initiative moves, but not quite sound because black has one defense here. You guys want to try and find it? Black's defense was bishop to g6, defending against white opening the f-file against his king. And now you sort of wish you still had your pawn on e4 to take on f5 and trap that bishop. But basically, I think that black escapes after bishop to g6. I mean, it's still a little bit complicated, but for example, if white wins back his piece like this, black's position is decently solid now, actually. His king's kind of covered, all his pieces are reasonable, and his rook can come out. And, maybe black has a tiny edge, which is funny, right? Because white sacked a knight on move 4, then he's sacking both his pawns and his rook on b7, and the evaluation I'm saying is maybe slight edge for black. But in the game, black obliged, gave us a beautiful game by taking the rook on b7. No points for guessing this move by white. Queen f5. Sorry, I can't just give out points for every single move. And now he's threatening queen f6, queen h5. Black played king to g8, and one more beautiful move for white here. What's the best move? Knight to e4, bringing one more piece to the attack. Black can't take the knight because of this checkmate here. And so in this position, he just gave up. Part of the strength of this move is that if black tried to defend with bishop to g7, you could now play queen to c8 check because your queen wouldn't have yet gone to f6. And now you can pick up this piece here in addition to everything else, right? Bishop here, then maybe you'll give knight f6 check, bishop f6, queen e8 check, king here, pawn takes bishop, right? That's called checkmate. So yeah, so knight e4, really beautiful move, and white won this game. And that's the second game I wanted to show you. And finally, in the last lecture, I will show you my own experiment with the Cochrane Gambit. Welcome back. This is International Master David Preuss, and this is my last lecture about the Cochrane Gambit in the Petrov. First two lectures, I showed you a couple games that I studied about 11 months ago when I was preparing to play the Cochrane Gambit for the first time. And today I will sum up the lessons that I learned and quickly show you what I'm calling the fruits of that labor, the game which I then played in the Cochrane Gambit the next day. So let's discuss what we have so far. We have that white could play either knight to c3 or d4. I knew that on d4, black has one extra option with queen to e8, which is pretty challenging attacking the e4 pawn. And also knew that against both knight to c3 and d4, the best variation for black was probably a variation which we haven't seen any games in, which is c5. Let me quickly show you one example game at blitz speed without explanation, since I feel like I really do owe you one game in this to illustrate what this line might look like. And I think the Topalov-Kramnik game, see, I don't have it in front of me and I don't remember it for sure, but I think the Topalov-Kramnik game went knight to c3, which is the move that I chose to play, c5, bishop c4 check, bishop e6, takes, d4. So that's how you reach the main variation with knight to c3. This game, white plays d4, black plays, c5, which is the best move. White plays bishop c4 check, bishop e6, takes, and now he plays knight c3. So you see, for what I consider the main line, it doesn't actually matter if you play knight to c3 or d4 on move 5 for white, because this leads to the same position as the Topalov game. So this game continues. C takes d4, queen takes d4. Now black gets a tempo for development. Knight c6, queen c4 check, king to d7. Where would you develop your bishop on c1? Which side would you castle to? Ask yourself some questions as I go through this, and or pause the video and think about it a little bit, because I know I'm going fast through this one. Castles queenside, rook to e8, king to b1. He plays king to c8 right away. White gets the third pawn, the weak pawn on d6. Black counterattacks with the queen in the center. Gets this pawn here. And after taking white's center pawn, white kind of lacks in compensation, but he has rook takes c6 check. And this game ended as follows. Draw agreed, unfortunately. That's sometimes what chess looks like. And that's another game of Solskjaer as white. And the reason why I don't want to give you, precisely all my analysis of, this mainline variation of the Cochrane Gambit is that you won't really be able to play chess if you know all my analysis. You'll get down to positions like this, and, you and your opponent will each just be able to play out, 15, 20 moves of some, forced best line that some master has recommended to you, and then you don't get to play a single chess move. Unfortunately, chess sometimes ends like this. So I want to save you that pain. Instead, I'll just give you the ideas and let you come up with this stuff on your own. Because honestly, this game here, if you had to find all the moves on your own, it'd be a cool game. That's fine. It's a little bit short, but at least, you found some interesting ideas and played a cool game. But if you just know about this and then play out all these moves, that is the height of lameness. It's just, really sad. You go out there to play and then you don't get to think about anything. So that will give you like a quick sense of some of the games that I had seen for the main line. So let's review the ideas for white. The ideas for white are to control the center with their pawns, deprive the black pieces of good squares, and try and make all of the black pieces into like slightly bad pieces. They're not going to be like these stereotypical bad pieces that are, trapped in the corner by a chain of pawns, like a knight on a8 against a pawn chain at a5 and b6 and c5 for white or something like that. No, they're not going to be, pieces which aren't even worthy of, being called pawns. But the idea is just to take away a little bit from their power, just each piece of blacks be a little bit limited. And also, white doesn't have a lot of very strong attacking continuations at the beginning. Okay, now eventually they could roll their pawns a little bit towards the king side, and if the black king is still there, you saw plenty of good attacking ideas for white in the games I showed you. But one of the reasons that you look through complete games like this is you're trying to pick up some patterns about how the games go, what they look like. So like one pattern you should notice is like, on what move does white start attacking in these games we've looked at? Well, seldom did white start attacking before move 15 or 20, right? So white doesn't have a lot of immediate attacking ideas, and that means black should deal first and foremost with white's idea of limiting their pieces, and only secondarily worry about king safety. And of course, if like white starts attacking your king, you realize at some point that they're attacking your king, right? I mean, it's not like you're blind. So if I start throwing pieces at your king, let's say I'm saying check every move, you should realize that like maybe I'm focused on your king and you should defend. But as long as I'm not saying any checks or even putting any pieces near your king, you need to worry more about white's central control than about defending your king. And therefore, it's absolutely the best principled move to play c5 for black right away here, even though I think that the queen e8 move also has some merit. Similarly, against knight c3, you got to play c5 to stop white from following up with d4. And the game which I played will explain to you why in just a moment, because my opponent hesitated and played c5 one move too late, and you'll see that white gets an edge that way. So against knight c3, the critical idea for black is to, again, stop d4 and, at least like position himself there. And that covers basically the key principles for the Petrov, for the Cochrane Gambit of the Petrov. So this game was played in a Berkeley International Tournament in December of 2008, and it was my only time that I can ever recall facing the Petrov in a tournament. That's because I play a lot of King's Gambits against Petrov players. But then I thought, I know f4 takes Petrov players out of their happy zone a little bit, but maybe the Cochrane Gambit would do it too. I've always known of this move. I knew Topalov played it once. It had a sort of slightly fascinating position in my mind, but I'd never looked at it. It was just one of those unexplored areas, like some Lake Tahoe that I'd never been to until this year. I knew about it. I knew people raved about it. I knew people said this is a great place to visit. But I didn't have any firsthand experience. I didn't really know what Lake Tahoe meant. So that's what the Cochrane Gambit was for me. And after having tried both, I can say Lake Tahoe is better than the Cochrane Gambit. So my game, I played knight to c3, and my opponent played bishop to e7, developing a piece. And I think what my opponent thought is that whenever white plays d4, you challenge the d-pawn with c5. But actually, that's not the case. Basically, the case is you play c5 as soon as you can to control and fight for the d4 square. So he plays one innocent developing move, and now I think already white can get an edge, though, my analysis is not at such a high level that you need to believe me. So he now countered with c5, and now I played bishop to c4 check. If you recall, one of the games that we saw, black played c6 in this position here to stop bishop c4 check with d5, and then they just played rook to e8. That was one of the games we saw. But okay, my opponent played c5, and now I played bishop c4 check. And now, suddenly, bishop e6 is no good for dealing with bishop c4 check because white plays d5, winning a tempo against this bishop. And it could be a really valuable tempo because, for example, white has options already of playing e5, pawn takes e5, d6 check, winning back their piece, and leaving their bishop on this really, really great diagonal. And with black with an isolated e5 pawn in the equal material position, definitely an edge for white. Of course, having won a tempo, I see no need necessarily to play e5 right away. I'm sure white can castle, and they also have an edge. So bishop e6 is basically out of the question once white's pawn is on d4. And that's the problem with losing a tempo on bishop e7. It's that you need to be able to answer, there are two moves you need to be able to answer from white in this variation. You need to be able to answer bishop c4 check with bishop e6 usually, and you need to be able to answer, sorry, maybe this would be a better way of indicating it. You need to be able to answer bishop c4 with bishop e6, and you need to be able to answer d4 with c5. So when white plays knight to c3 here, black doesn't have time to play a move like bishop e7 because now d4, c5, check. And my opponent was forced to play king f8. And now this hurts his development a little bit. The rook's a little bit slow coming out. And not only that, but now I don't trade on c5. Of course, white could play something like castles and takes. This is perfectly fine for white. Again, compared to the variation that we saw in the Solstice game 5 minutes ago, black didn't have bishop e6, so their king is on a weird position and white's bishop controls this nice diagonal. So, you can play knight c6, queen to e3, and, white should have like a playable game here. But all hope is not lost for black. Anyway, we're not going to analyze that too far. I'm just going to say, like, I could have done that. But what I chose to do was to play d5, actually keeping the position closed for now and blocking my bishop's great diagonal because I like using white's pawns to limit the black pieces. I think that's a really good strategy. So now we've got a pawn structure quite a bit like the Benoni. And the Benoni is an opening which shares with the Cochrane Gambit this notion that black would really, really like to trade at least one piece because they lack space. So black plays a6 now, and white plays a4 to stop black from gaining space with b5. That would hurt white's two pieces really badly, and let black have a little extra space maybe for their pieces. So a4 is completely forced. Black plays knight to d7, and now there's another move which I think is basically forced for white. What move is that? Good. Congratulations on finding that. In some other examples, we'd seen white playing h3 first, covering g4 before playing moves like f4. But here, what they need to do is not give black time to play knight to e5, I think, which untangles the knight, gets it towards the king side. So here, you need to play f4 to stop e5, and notice that black can't yet use the g4 square because it's covered by your queen. They do have a way to try to get at that square a little bit. It looks like this, bishop g4, queen to d3. But this variation is not too harmful for white because they will follow up with h3 and g4 and stuff like that, and have plenty of space. They'll also play a5 probably at some point, and e5. For one thing, notice that, okay, I'll play some random move just to show you an idea. In these positions, if I push e5 early on, taking always loses back the piece because the bishop has no mobility. So white can definitely push through e5 pretty quickly, probably against this knight to b6, bishop to g4. White will probably be able to play e5 pretty quickly in that line. So again, your strategy is to control squares with your pawns. Your tactics are, do I play f4 first, controlling e5 right away, or do I need to play h3, controlling g4? In the other game, we saw white's pawn was on d4. Black wasn't threatening to play anything like knight to e5, and white was in no hurry to play f4, controlling e5 in extra time. But also with the knight on, a6 or b8, black had the idea of knight to g4 in one important variation, and so white played h3 to cover it. If black doesn't have knight to g4 in some particular way that's annoying to white, there's no reason you need to always play h3 and take your time, right? You're just playing the right moves to limit black's pieces, and you have to calculate a little bit in order to do that. So f4 is the correct move here, and now I recall my opponent thought for a while trying to figure out how to untangle. And I think that the two best plans for black are actually pretty similar, or best. I mean, the two most plausible. One is to play queen to e8, and then bishop to e8, and bishop to a5, which will put pressure on white's e4 pawn, right? And try and restrain white along the e file. A theme also from the Benoni, right? To try and control e5 and e4, and maybe put a little bit of pressure on the e pawn. That's very similar to what he plays in the game, which is knight to e8, with the idea of bishop f6 and queen to e7, also with pressure against the e4 square. So he plays knight to e8. Now, should you play h3? No, you should castle. So white castles, and black plays bishop to f6. And here is one really key point in the game, because I was calculating this variation, where black is going to sacrifice a pawn in order to trade off quite a bit of material. They're going to give up one pawn, they're going to gain some squares, and get rid of some of their pieces. Most notably the queen, which is nice because the black king position isn't great in this particular game. Now queen takes b6, knight takes b6, bishop to b3. So after black played bishop f6, before playing bishop e3, I looked at this endgame for quite a while. And this is like an instructive position, definitely, for for understanding the Cochrane gambit. White has 3 pawns against a knight. That's already like fairly sufficient in an endgame in general. But okay, I mean, does White have any advantage? Even after Black's misplayed the opening a little bit by spending a tempo on bishop e7? Can they just get to this endgame and have a perfectly fine game? Well, I think the answer is no. I think that White definitely has an advantage in this endgame. For one thing, Black's pieces are not well coordinated. For another thing, all White's pawns are still 3 central pawns. And I really think that even with the queens off the board, you can definitely play a style of game here for White where you try and dominate the central squares and keep the Black pieces from being very good. So I think White's going to manage to play e5 for sure, which is going to put pressure on the d6 pawn, and then they'll be able to play knight e4, putting more pressure on the d6 pawn maybe, and c4 and so on. And I've looked at this endgame a little bit, and I agree with what I thought during the game, which is that White has an edge in this endgame here. By the way, one important move I think might be a5 for Black, because with the light squared bishops, the move a5 is pretty important. Like on knight d7, a5, knight c5, bishop c4, and then White just follows up with b4, and White, gets all these pawns on dark squares, which I think is very helpful for them and leaves their light squared bishop pretty good. So I think, not to mention that a5 just gains even more space, and b4 gains even more space, and e5 gains even more space. So to be honest, I don't know which reason is the underlying cause for why a5 is important. It's either that gaining space is really good for White, or that getting pawns on dark squares is good. Could be either effect that's so important here. So anyway, we'll return to the game. I mean, I think that would have been a decent option for Black, all things considered. I mean, it admits that White has an advantage, but certainly gives you chances to defend a pretty long game for Black. In the game, he continued with his idea of attacking the e4 pawn, and basically he could calculate already that White can't defend the e4 pawn, but I think that he's spending so much time to try and win it in a game where he's already got trouble getting his rooks out. So basically, logically, I wouldn't exactly expect this to work out, shall we say. I'm reluctant to say that it's completely illogical, because it just barely works out for White. It's not like White has, 100 ways to win and this is, complete stupidity. It's really close to working for Black, but I do remember not being very concerned about it in the game. And, when I calculated things as being good for White, I wasn't too unconfident. I wasn't, double checking too much, because I really believe that it makes sense that, after Black plays knight to e8 and queen to e7 and bishop e7 to f6 to c3, that White should be able to just push e5, sacrificing a pawn and opening the files for their 2 rooks when Black has 2 rooks at home. So I really believed in that and wasn't too worried here. That said, maybe one detail different, and I would be sitting here wondering, why my rooks didn't have as much effect on the game as I wanted them to have. So queen d3, first of all, only move defending this pawn for the moment. And Black now trades on c3 and brings out their knight to f6 to attack the e4 pawn. They could have also attacked it with the other knight, or they could have played this variation knight to b6. Against knight here to f6, of course, you also just push e5. And now on pawn takes pawn, you have to play pawn takes pawn. And on queen takes pawn, this position should be pretty good for White in a number of ways. I mean, I know you could play bishop takes c5 check, but I would also kind of like to play rook a to e1. So that threatens bishop c5 check even much more than before. Now maybe something like queen d6, bishop to f4, queen to d8, d6. To me, this looks really promising for White as well. So, of course, you could also go check here and rook a e1. And it turns out that would have been a lot simpler. So sometimes you should just play the obvious moves that like take pieces while saying check. And this is completely over because of variations like queen here. I know there's even d6 check, right? But there's also, rook to e8. So you see this is getting really easy for white at this point. Okay, so that knight to f6 wouldn't have been a big bother. He could have played knight to b6, bishop b3, trade off one of the white pieces to get to this position. But still, I think white's going to play e5. Black's rooks aren't going to come out, and white has good solid advantage in this position here too. I think, oh, sorry. Let me say one more thing about this. I think the opposite colored bishops are going to help white to attack in this kind of a situation. So when they play e5, they're going to try and crack black's dark squares. They're going to play rook to e1. In some cases, they'll have bishop c5 or bishop d4. And it's going to be really, really hard for black to defend those squares. So my opponent played knight f6. Of course, I didn't want to, let them play queen takes e4. So I sacked my pawn this way, right? Which, if they accept the pawn sacrifice, lets the d pawn move forward and opens up the light squared bishop. So finally, white's not able to defend his whole center forever at this point. So he's going to finally sacrifice it after black's used quite a bit of energy to siege it. Energy and time, right? Now he's going to sacrifice it and use the lines that open up to turn the game into an attack on the black king, since white's now quite a bit ahead in development. Not always the case in the Cochrane, but that's developed at this point. So he takes, and I push. He plays queen to e8. Queen to e8 was also possible, but I remember being quite unperturbed about this. I would trade, takes, and play queen to d5, attacking this knight. He can't take my queen because the rook's opposite his king. I believe here he would probably trade off the bishop, right? Because his knight's attacked. Makes sense to trade off one of white's attacking pieces. And, well, here he's still facing a really, really strong attack from white because, for example, let's say we play like the most obvious developing move from black, bishop d7, blockading the d6 pawn. I think here white could use this idea, rook takes f6. If pawn takes, bishop h6 check, king to e8, rook e1 check, right? That's a nice little blowout. So rook f6 check, they can't take it with the pawn, they have to take it with the queen, and now you play rook f1, trade your rooks for their queen and knight. And in a position like this, it's two rooks against a queen and the passed d6 pawn. But there are like three main factors that can let a queen sometimes triumph against two rooks. Those three factors are: 1, the rooks are disconnected, or 2, white has threats to attack the king, and or 3, the queen has an advanced passed pawn to work with. In this position, all three are the case. Additionally, the light squared bishops increase white's attacking chances quite a bit. So I think this position is probably completely winning for white in some pretty easy way, probably. I mean, maybe just queen to e2, maybe queen to f4 to go to e5. I don't really see black as defending this position. I had not calculated any further than that in the game and don't really feel any need to now because I'm pretty confident that that's winning for white. So black played queen to e8. Now I take on e5 as well. In this case, knight takes e5 is even worse than before. Why is that? Please tell me you got it. You got to be able to recognize patterns when you've seen them 3 seconds ago. So there it is. That's why black can't take with the knight. So unfortunately, he has to leave the knight blocking his bishop. He took with the queen. And here's that, rook a e1 move again. And again, when you play a move like rook AE1, you're about to win in these kinds of positions. You know, your opponent's king is still in the center and you play rook AE1. Very, very good for you. So here's how the game finishes up. Black doesn't really have any particular defense. The game is drawing to a conclusion. He plays knight to b6. By now, I think there's more than one way for me to have won this game. I think I remember during the game I was looking at bishop h6 and thinking that that was also winning for white. But bishop to f4, I saw like what I considered to be a really, really, really pretty position, and so I tried to set it up. Well, tried to. I mean, I kind of forced what I considered to be a pretty win. So the queen has to go to f5 to offer the queen trade. And now I play what move? You can just try and find the last couple moves of this game. You'll perhaps feel about as satisfied as I did when I played it, if you find them. So d6, that threatens bishop to d6 checkmate and d8 queen, which would also be checkmate in 1. And it also threatens queen takes queen because it cuts the connection between the bishop and queen. So d7, black trades queens, defending bishop d6 and defending d8 and defending queen takes queen. Now what does white do? All right. Basically, if you want to take back that piece for that pawn, you're not being realistic about what's required of you in this position. White is still down. White is still down a piece, even in. I mean, white is down a piece. So even if you like win back a piece like this, it's not like you're winning this game, right? This is not like the right kind of objective. You know, you're also developing black's pieces, saving his king from back rank mate. So there were 2 correct answers that you could have come up with here. I like the one I chose, but you can play the 2 moves that I played in either order. So rook to e8 check. The king can't move, so the knight has to take it. And now bishop f4, double check and checkmate. To me, this position is really beautiful, and that's like the main thing that I like about this game is just that the final position is kind of like a pretty picture, like a nice painting that you would like. I mean, on the board, white is currently down a queen, a rook, and a minor piece, which is a lot of material. On top of that, his bishop's hanging, and his rook is attacked. So if black weren't in double check, I mean, they could collect all white's pieces here, right? You know, with queen takes f1 and knight takes d6 or knight takes c4, bishop takes d7. I mean, every single piece of white's is either off the board or hanging, but it's checkmate. So I really like that. So let's quickly go through the lessons of this game. First of all, remind you that this sacrifice probably leads to about an equal position, a pretty interesting one. Second of all, that it's important to play c5 right away. And that in this position here, the reason why things don't work out for black is that on bishop c4 check, if they block, d5 comes with tempo. And finally, well, not finally, another lesson is, whoops, wrong move order, is that white is, again, trying to think of how to restrict all the opponent's pieces and take their squares away. And the final lesson, and really the main point of this game for me, is just how pretty this position is at the end of the game. So we're going to go forward to it again, just because I like it. Hey, this game was requested, so now you're going to have to deal with me enjoying it. And sometimes the point of chess is just that it's beautiful. And for me, that's very important. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you understand the Cochrane Gambit now. And I hope that you can also play a couple interesting games with this line. And